My name is Ashwin Berry, and welcome to Second Take. There is something almost mythological about a leader who, even in death, refuses to rest. Edgar Lungu has, in a way no speech ever could, engineered the most politically potent silence Zambia has seen in years. Not through policy, not through power, but through absence. A body that will not settle. A coffin that has become a courtroom exhibit. A funeral that has turned into a referendum on power, memory, and the stubborn architecture of political grudges. When he died in South Africa in June 2025, what should have followed was choreography. Flags at half-mast, military precision, a solemn procession through Lusaka. Instead, what unfolded was resistance, not from the streets, not from opposition benches, but from the most intimate circle around him, his family. They said no. No to the state funeral, no to the choreography, no to Hakainde Hichilema presiding over the final chapter. And in that refusal, they cracked open something deeper than protocol. They challenged the idea that the state owns the memory of its leaders, that a presidency once held becomes public property even in death. Zambia, like many African states, treats former presidents as institutional symbols, not private individuals. Their deaths are meant to unify, to remind the nation of continuity. But this time, continuity met resistance. Because beneath the formal language of state honor was a personal history that refused to be buried alongside the body. This was not just about a funeral. This was about a relationship that had long collapsed, a rivalry that had stretched from elections to arrests, from power to humiliation. The memory of 2017, when Hichilema was detained under Lungu's administration, hung in the air like a ghost no one wanted to name, but everyone understood. So, when the government moved swiftly to claim the body, it wasn't seen as respect, it was seen as control. And control in death is even more symbolic than in life. The family insisted that Lungu had made his wishes clear, that he did not want the current president anywhere near his burial, that he preferred a private farewell far from the theater of politics. And suddenly, the most powerful institution in the country found itself negotiating with grief. Not public grief, but private grief fortified by legal counsel. What followed was not mourning, it was strategy. Meetings collapsed, agreements were drafted and redrafted, announcements were made and withdrawn. Zambia prepared for a funeral that never came. A grave was readied in Lusaka, polished, symbolic, waiting, but it remained empty. And in that emptiness, something began to shift. The absence became louder than any ceremony could have been, because a state funeral is meant to close a chapter. This dispute refused closure. It stretched time, it suspended finality, and in doing so, it transformed Lungu from a former president into a contested symbol, not just of leadership, but of ownership. Who owns a legacy? The state that hosted it, or the family that lived it? And as this question lingered, the body remained in South Africa, preserved, protected, politicized. A former president reduced, or perhaps elevated, into a legal argument. And the longer it stayed unburied, the more it began to resemble something else entirely. Not a body waiting for rest, but a country struggling to agree on how to remember.
Welcome to Namibia, where adventure meets tranquility. With Enjoy, you have access to a wide range of accommodations to suit every traveler's taste and budget. Experience the finest dining and hospitality Namibia has to offer. Booking your dream accommodation is just a few clicks away with Enjoy. Join thousands of happy travelers who have trusted Enjoy for their Namibian getaway. Your gateway to unforgettable Namibian adventures. Visit us today at enjoy.my.na.
If politics is theater, then the courtroom became Zambia's most unusual burial ground, not with soil and silence, but with affidavits, counter arguments, and the quiet authority of judges who now found themselves deciding not just on law, but on legacy. The case, formerly framed as the Zambian government versus the Lungu family, was anything but ordinary. It was not about land, not about contracts, it was about a body, a former president's body. And with that came a question that no legal textbook fully prepares you for. Does the state have the right to bury you in a way you may not have wanted? The government argued from principle. Former heads of state, they said, are not private citizens. Their lives and by extension their deaths belong to the nation. A state funeral is not optional. It is a duty, a ritual of continuity, a signal to the world that the nation honors its leaders regardless of political transitions. To deny that, they argued, was to undermine the dignity of the office itself. But the family countered with something more intimate. They spoke of wishes, of conversations, of a man who they say had expressed clearly and repeatedly that he did not want certain individuals involved in his burial. And in that argument, the abstract collided with the personal. The courtroom became a space where law had to interpret emotion, where judges had to weigh constitutional expectations against whispered instructions that were never meant for public scrutiny. When the South African High Court initially ruled in favor of the Zambian government in August 2025, it seemed briefly that the matter was settled. Repatriation would proceed, the body would return, and the state would reclaim its ritual. But the family appealed, and in that appeal, the case transformed from a decision into a process. A slow, grinding process that extended months into nearly a year. Meanwhile, the body remained where it was, preserved in a funeral home in South Africa, guarded not just by refrigeration, but by legal uncertainty. And this is where the absurdity began to sharpen. Because while the courts deliberated, life continued. Zambia governed, policies were debated, elections looming on the horizon. But somewhere in a facility far from Lusaka, a former president waited, not for burial, but for judgment. It is a strange thing when death becomes conditional, when rest is deferred pending legal clarity. And as the months passed, the case began to attract more than just legal attention. It became a symbol, a talking point, a quiet embarrassment, if you will. Because in many African cultures, burial is not just a ritual, it is a necessity, a spiritual obligation. To delay it is to disturb something deeper than politics. And yet, here was a nation doing exactly that, not out of neglect, but out of conflict. The courts, in trying to resolve the dispute, had inadvertently prolonged it. Every ruling was followed by an appeal, every decision by a countermeasure. And in that loop, the body remained suspended between jurisdictions, between interpretations, between two competing visions of respect. One institutional, one personal, and neither willing to yield. By nearly 2026, the case had evolved into something larger than itself. It was no longer just about where Lungu would be buried. It was about what his burial would represent. A victory for state authority or a validation of personal autonomy. And as the legal arguments grew more intricate, the simplicity of death, its finality, its certainty, felt increasingly distant. Because in this case, death had not ended anything. It had only begun a different kind of struggle.
Namibia is a land of movement, with waves that never stop reaching forward. Here, adventure is not something we search for. It is something we are born into. In every corner of this country, creativity rises, from artists, from athletes, from dreamers. And when the world comes to explore Namibia, they discover something extraordinary. Because when sport moves people, creativity moves ideas, and tourism moves the world toward us. Something powerful happens. a platform where movement meets imagination, where industries connect, where opportunity grows, where Namibia's next chapter begins. Welcome to the Creative Sport Tourism Expo. Exhibit, partner, experience. Creative Sport Tourism.
There is a peculiar discomfort that settles in when a nation realizes it cannot bury its past, not metaphorically but literally. Zambia found itself in that discomfort, a country with a prepared grave and no body, a former president with a funeral plan and no consensus, and in that gap between intention and reality, reflection began to creep in. Quietly at first, then more insistently, because the longer the dispute dragged on, the harder it became to ignore what it revealed. This was not just about Edgar Lungu. It was about Zambia's relationship with power, with transition, with the idea that leadership changes but memory does not. The empty grave in Lusaka became more than a logistical detail. It became a symbol, a reminder that closure had not been achieved, that something unresolved lingered beneath the surface of political civility. And while official statements maintained a tone of respect and protocol, the subtext was harder to ignore. This was a country negotiating with its own history. The rivalry between Lungu and Hichilema was never just electoral. It was personal, institutional, deeply embedded in the narrative of Zambia's recent political evolution. And now in death, that rivalry had found a new arena. Not rallies, not parliament, but burial. The body in South Africa became a focal point of that tension, a physical representation of a relationship that refused to reconcile. And as the months passed, the question shifted. It was no longer simply where will he be buried, but why can't we agree? Because agreement in this context would have required something rare in politics: concession. The state would have had to acknowledge the legitimacy of personal wishes over institutional norms. The family would have had to accept the symbolic importance of a state funeral. Neither side moved, and so the stalemate persisted. Meanwhile, public sentiment began to fragment. Some saw the government's position as necessary. A former president, they argued, deserves national recognition. Others sided with the family, viewing the insistence on state control as an overreach, a final assertion of authority over a man who in life had already exited power. And then there was a third perspective, less vocal but deeply felt, a sense of unease, of cultural disruption, because in many African traditions, burial is not negotiable. It is not something to be debated in courts or delayed indefinitely. It is an obligation to the living and the dead. And the longer Lungu remained unburied, the more that obligation felt unfulfilled. This is where the dispute transcended politics. It entered the realm of belief, of spirituality, of collective discomfort, and yet even that was not enough to break the deadlock, because the dispute had become too symbolic to resolve easily. It was no longer just about a body. It was about that body represented authority, resistance, memory, control. And in that complexity, resolution became elusive. By the time 2026 unfolded, the situation had hardened. Legal processes continued. Appeals were filed. Deadlines were proposed and contested. But the fundamental issue remained unchanged. No agreement, no burial, just a body in limbo and a nation quietly grappling with what that meant. Because sometimes the most revealing moments in politics are not the loud ones, not the elections or the speeches, but the silences, the delays, the unresolved. And in this case, the unresolved was lying in a funeral home, waiting for a decision that seemed perpetually just out of reach.
I'm sure you've heard the news, and Namibia is calling. And it's time to answer with a smile. From the rolling sand dunes of Sossusvlei to the wildlife wonders of Etosha National Park, Namibia is a treasure trove of natural beauty and adventure. With Enjoy, booking the most renowned lodges is as easy as a desert breeze. Picture yourself sipping coffee on a deck, watching the sunrise. Paint the sky in hues of gold and orange. Or how about a thrilling safari, capturing memories that'll last a lifetime? Our easy-to-use website hosts the most beautiful lodges Namibia has to offer. Whether you crave luxury or a cozy hideaway, we've got you covered. So pack your bags and let's turn your dream adventure into reality. Namibia awaits, and with Enjoy, your perfect stay is just a click away.
Explore the beauty of Namibia with our car rentals. From wide open spaces to the plains of Namibia's national parks. Enjoy the freedom of the open road. Go anywhere you want, whenever you want. We've got you covered, even in the most remote locations. Visit our website and see what we have to offer.
And then came this recent week, not with resolution, but with escalation. Because if the past year had been defined by delay, this moment was defined by movement, sudden, contested, almost chaotic movement. A South African court decision opened the door for the Zambian government to take custody of the body of Edgar Lungu. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though the stalemate had been broken, that the long-awaited repatriation might finally happen. The machinery of state began to turn. Plans were revisited, logistics activated, the possibility of a state funeral re-entered the realm of reality. But in this dispute, nothing moves in a straight line. Almost immediately, another legal intervention reversed the momentum. The removal of the body was challenged, the process questioned, and in a twist that perfectly encapsulates the absurdity of the entire saga, the court ordered that the body be returned back to the funeral home, back to where it had been, back to limbo. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this is. A former president's body being moved, then ordered back, not by family decision or state ceremony, but by legal instruction. The courts were no longer just interpreting the dispute. They were actively managing the physical location of the deceased. And in doing so, they highlighted just how far this situation had drifted from anything resembling normality. A deadline has now been set, May 2026, a date that carries the weight of expectation, the suggestion that by then the matter should be resolved, that the body should be transferred, that burial should finally occur. But if the past year has taught us anything, it is that deadlines in this dispute are more aspirational than definitive, because the underlying issues remain unchanged. The family has not conceded. The government has not retreated. And the courts, while authoritative, are still navigating a case that sits at the intersection of law, politics, and deeply personal grief. So what does this last week actually change? On the surface, it introduces urgency, a timeline, a sense that the dispute cannot continue indefinitely. But beneath that, it reinforces the central reality. This is not just a legal matter. It is a symbolic one. And symbolic disputes are rarely resolved by deadlines alone. They require something else, a shift, a compromise, a moment of recognition that the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of conceding. That moment has not yet arrived. And so as it stands, Edgar Lungu remains unburied, not forgotten, not ignored, but contested. His death has become a continuation of his political life by other means, a final chapter that refuses to be written. And in that refusal, it has exposed something profound about power, that it does not end when a presidency does, that it lingers in memory, in relationships, in unresolved tensions that even death cannot resolve. Zambia now waits, not just for a burial, but for a decision that would define how it remembers one of its former leaders. And perhaps, more importantly, how it understands the balance between state authority and personal legacy. Because in the end, this is not just about where Edgar Lungu will be buried. It is about who gets to decide. Here is our correspondent in Zambia, Mike Sichula, giving us the details of the story.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, the state of affairs is as what has been reported in various media houses following Wednesday's turn of events, where the nation was informed by Attorney General Mr. Muliro Kabesha that the government of Zambia was in custody of the remains of Dr. Lungu, who died on the 5th of June in South Africa. As you may recall, in August last year, the South African High Court delivered a ruling in which it told the Lungu family that they were not supposed to keep the body of Mr. Lungu because Mr. Lungu was a former president and the Zambian government had all the rights to have the body so that Mr. Lungu can be given a befitting funeral as a former head of state. However, on Wednesday evening, Mr. Makebi Zulu, the family spokesperson, told the nation that whatever has happened has been reversed by the High Court court order that demanded and directed the South African government and the Zambian government to hand over the body to the Lungu family and this body to be returned to two mountains, a private mortuary where the body of Mr. Lungu has been kept for the last 9 months. However, we have also been told that the mortuary has indicated to the Lungu family that if the decision that has been made by the Supreme Court is final, the Lungu family should not return the body to their mortuary. They must find an alternative. Then yesterday again, Mr. Makebi Zulu left Zambia for South Africa, and when he was interviewed at Kenneth Kaunda International Airport, he indicated that he was flying to South Africa to ensure that the South African government and the Zambian government respect the order that has been issued by the Supreme Court, restraining them from keeping the remains of Dr. Lungu. So one thing that also our viewers need to know is that there has been talk in Zambia where the Zambian government has been insisting and pushing that Mr. Lungu should be buried before the 5th of June 2026 and also before Zambia heads to the elections on August 13th, 2026. Then aside that, something that also has happened which the government has not explained is President Hakainde Hichilema was due to officiate at a national event in Luapula province at what is being called the Luapula Expo. But we have been told that that event, or President Hakainde Hichilema has cancelled that event, and people now are speculating as to why President Hakainde Hichilema has cancelled. Is it because of the turn of events surrounding the remains of Dr. Lungu? So these are some of the things that we are yet to be updated, and we're hoping that in the coming days something concrete is going to come with regard the remains of Dr. Edgar Lungu. Thank you very much for having me.